guys. If you enjoy my videos, consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would really appreciate it. The old ranger station at Hollow Rock wasn't much more than a glorified shed. The peeling green paint on its wooden panels, the sagging porch steps, and the dusty windows made it clear this place had been forgotten by anyone who didn't need it. My Uncle Mason was one of the few who still came here willingly. He'd been a ranger for decades, long enough to see the station go from the heart of the local forest to an outpost for emergencies only. Mason claimed he didn't mind the isolation, that the quiet kept his head clear, but there was something in his tone whenever he spoke about Hollow Rock. When he invited me to stay overnight during one of his shifts, I jumped at the opportunity. After years of strained family dinners and vague updates about his work, I wanted to understand him better. Besides, the forest always felt like an escape to me, something raw and untamed, far from the chaos of everyday life. I didn't know then how raw and untamed it truly was. The drive into the forest was long and uneventful, the narrow dirt road winding through groves of old pine and birch. The sun dipped lower as we drove, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Ever been out here before?" Mason asked, breaking the silence. "Nope," I replied. "Didn't even know this place existed until you mentioned it." He smirked. "Most people don't. Hollow Rock's not exactly a tourist hotspot. The trails are overgrown, the wildlife's unpredictable, and the cell service is non-existent. It's just me and the forest out here." "That doesn't get lonely?" He shrugged. "Sometimes. But it's peaceful, too. Quiet in a way the rest of the world isn't." The station appeared suddenly as we rounded a bend. It sat perched on a rocky outcrop, half hidden by trees. A rusted metal sign swung lazily in the breeze, the words, "Hollow Rock Ranger Station," barely legible. "This is it," Mason said, pulling the truck to a stop. The inside of the station was cleaner than I expected, though the furniture was sparse. A desk piled with papers sat near the window, and a small cot was tucked into the corner. A wall-mounted radio crackled faintly, its antenna angled toward the ceiling. "Make yourself at home," Mason said, tossing his bag onto the cot. "It's not fancy, but it does the job." As I settled in, Mason handed me a folded piece of paper. "Here," he said, "rules for the night. Read them, follow them, and we won't have any problems." I unfolded the paper, expecting to see a list of safety tips. What I found instead made my stomach turn. 1. Stay inside after sunset. No exceptions. 2. If you hear footsteps on the roof, do not look outside. 3. The lantern must remain lit. Do not let the flame die. 4. If the clock strikes 3:12 a.m. and the wind stops, hide. 5. Do not respond to anyone knocking on the door, no matter what they say. 6. If the radio goes silent, turn it off immediately. Do not turn it back on. 7. Stay away from the basement. Do not open the hatch. I laughed nervously. "Is this a joke?" Mason's expression didn't change. "No, it's serious." "Come on, this is ridiculous. Footsteps on the roof? A haunted basement?" "Call it what you want, but you'll follow the rules if you want to make it through the night." Something in his tone left no room for argument. I folded the paper and shoved it into my pocket, my skepticism replaced by a creeping unease. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. Mason busied himself with paperwork, occasionally glancing at the radio as if expecting it to say something important. The lantern on the desk flickered softly, casting long shadows across the room. I tried to focus on the book I'd brought, but the rules lingered in the back of my mind. "What happens if I don't follow the rules?" I asked. Mason looked up, his face serious. "You don't want to find out." Before I could press further, a distant noise caught my attention. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the lantern, but it grew louder, a steady, deliberate tapping sound. "Footsteps," Mason muttered, his eyes narrowing. "On the roof?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded. "Remember the rule." We sat in tense silence as the footsteps moved across the roof, slow and methodical. My breath caught in my throat and my grip on the book tightened. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the soft hiss of the lantern in its wake. "See," Mason said, his tone calm but firm. "Nothing to worry about if you follow the rules." As the hours dragged on, the forest outside seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The radio crackled intermittently, its static filling the silence between Mason and me. Around midnight, the lantern began to sputter. The flame wavered, its light dimming. "Do we have more oil for this thing?" I asked, glancing nervously at Mason. "In the cabinet," he said, already reaching for a canister. "It can't go out." "Why not?" He didn't answer, pouring the oil into the lantern with practiced precision. The flame steadied, its warm glow returning. I leaned back in my chair, my heart still racing. "What happens if it does go out?" Mason met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "It won't." The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound filling the cabin as the radio crackled softly. Midnight in the forest felt different than midnight anywhere else. The dark wasn't just an absence of light, it was something heavier, almost alive. "You don't have to look so tense," Mason said, leaning back in his chair. "The rules are straightforward. Keep your head and we'll be fine." "That's easy for you to say," I muttered. "You've been doing this for years. I'm not used to whatever this is." He smirked but didn't respond. I wanted to push him for more answers, but the unease in his expression stopped me. It was like he didn't want to say too much, afraid the wrong words might make things worse. Instead, I stared at the lantern, its steady flame the only thing keeping the room from falling into darkness. My eyes kept drifting to the hatch in the floor, a heavy wooden door with rusted hinges and a thick padlock. "You said to stay away from the basement," I said, breaking the silence. "What's down there?" Mason's smirk faded. "Nothing you need to worry about." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting," he snapped. "Just keep your distance from the hatch. That's the easiest rule to follow." I dropped the subject, but my curiosity gnawed at me. The hatch felt like it was watching me, its edges framed by shadows that seemed darker than the rest of the room. The first knock came at 1:13 a.m. It was soft, almost polite, and it sent a jolt of fear through me. Mason froze, his hand halfway to the radio. He exchanged a glance with me before standing and walking slowly to the door. He didn't open it. Instead, he stood still, his ear pressed to the wood. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice steady. There was no response. He waited for a long moment, then stepped back, his expression grim. "Remember the rule," he said quietly. "We don't open the door." Another knock followed, louder this time. My pulse quickened as I stared at the door. It was solid, reinforced with metal strips, but it suddenly felt flimsy, like it could splinter at any moment. "Mason," I whispered, "what if—" "Shh." We waited. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. Whoever or whatever was outside wasn't in a hurry. Each knock seemed calculated, meant to wear us down. Then it stopped. Mason exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. "It's gone." I wasn't so sure. My eyes stayed fixed on the door, half expecting it to burst open, but the room remained quiet, save for the crackling of the radio and the soft hiss of the lantern. At 2:45 a.m., the radio went silent. One moment it was crackling faintly, its static a comforting background noise. The next, it was dead. Mason's head snapped toward it, his expression darkening. "Turn it off," I hesitated. "But turn it off," he barked. I scrambled to my feet and flipped the switch. The room felt quieter without the static, the silence pressing in around us. "What happened?" I asked. "Sometimes the signal drops," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. "It's fine, we don't need it." But I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand hovered near the rifle propped against the desk. He was worried. A faint sound drifted in through the walls, like whispers carried on the wind. I turned to Mason, but he shook his head. "Don't listen to it." "How can I not listen to it?" I hissed. It's there." "It's not real," he said firmly. "Ignore it." But the whispers grew louder, rising and falling like a tide. They were just words, jumbled and indistinct. But the cadence was wrong, Too slow, too deliberate. My chest tightened as the whispers seemed to press against my ears, filling my head. "Keep your focus on the lantern," Mason said. "Don't let it go out." The clock struck 3:12 a.m. and the wind outside stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The sudden stillness was unnerving, the absence of movement leaving the forest eerily still. Mason's expression hardened, and he stood, grabbing the rifle. "Hide," he said. "What?" My voice cracked. "Why? What's happening?" "Hide," he snapped, gesturing toward the cot. "Get under there and don't make a sound." I didn't argue. I scrambled under the cot, pressing myself flat against the floorboards. Mason moved to the lantern, his back to me, the rifle held tightly in his hands. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, the flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then came the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, heavy boots crunching against the gravel outside. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. Mason stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the door. The flame in the lantern wavered, its light dimming. "Stay calm," he whispered, though I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or himself. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A new sound filled the room, a soft, scraping noise, like nails on wood. It was coming from the hatch. My heart pounded as I stared at the padlocked door, the shadows around it shifting unnaturally. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, as if something on the other side was desperate to get in. "Mason," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What's down there?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the hatch, his knuckles white as he gripped the rifle. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep guttural growl. "We need to leave," Mason said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." "What about the rules?" I asked. "Screw the rules," he said, grabbing the lantern. "Get up, we're leaving." I crawled out from under the cot, my legs shaking as I stood. Mason unlocked the door, his movements quick and precise. The moment the door swung open, the whispers surged, louder and more chaotic. "Don't look back," Mason said, pulling me into the night. "No matter what you hear, don't look back." The forest outside the cabin was cloaked in shadows, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. The air was unnervingly still, heavy with the absence of sound. Mason led the way, the lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other, his movements deliberate and steady. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my ears. The silence was unbearable, a void that pressed down on my chest. Even our footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "What's happening?" I whispered, afraid to break the stillness, but even more afraid of the unknown. "Not now," Mason said, his voice low. "Just keep moving." We moved deeper into the forest, away from the cabin and whatever had been scratching at the hatch. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting unnaturally in the dim light of the lantern. The footsteps returned. At first, I thought it was just the sound of our own movements echoing in the silence, but the rhythm was off, too slow, too deliberate. They came from behind us, growing louder with each step. "Mason," I whispered, panic rising in my voice. "Don't stop," he said, his tone sharp, "and don't look back." The footsteps grew closer, each one sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't resist the urge to glance over my shoulder, even though I knew I shouldn't. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. 2 pinpricks of light hovered in the darkness, glowing faintly like distant stars. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and they didn't move like eyes. They simply stared, unblinking. "Nate!" Mason's voice snapped me out of my trance. He grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "What did I say? Don't look back." "There's something there," I stammered, my voice shaking. "I know," he said, "but looking at it makes it worse. Keep your eyes ahead." I forced myself to look forward, but the image of those glowing eyes was burned into my mind. They felt alive, like they were watching me even now. We stumbled into a small clearing, the faint light of the moon breaking through the canopy. Mason stopped, his breathing heavy, and held the lantern high, scanning the area. "Why are we stopping?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.